Who's the block in the State Department? We need to know who to write to.
Starts with Secretary Schultz, but writing to him won't help because he'll pass it on to Jerry Hellman. You've got to write to the President and to Congress, because members of Congress will be ever more vigorous if they know their constituents are supporting them on something like this.
We need to tell them to put the pressure on the State Department.
Absolutely.
To do the legislature that they've already mandated.
Oh, absolutely. Let me give you an example of what happens when Congress acts. You know, as I said, there's been virtually no effective outside aid going to Afghanistan at all. And last summer, Congress voted a huge, munificent sum of $2 million for medical aid inside Afghanistan. Now, $2 million won't buy you much of a villa in Beverly Hills. But that was the first overt, open humanitarian aid ever voted for Afghanistan since the Soviets invaded in '79. The State Department was given the mandate to distribute this aid inside Afghanistan for humanitarian aid. I went to bat, the Committee for Free Afghanistan went to bat to get a piece of that, if not all of it, for Dr. Robert Simon's International Medical Corps, for the network of American mobile surgical hospitals working inside Afghanistan. We fought like tigers for a piece of that. The ultimate of it was that 1.2 million of it went to the Red Cross, which will not work inside Afghanistan. They do good work in Pakistan for that surviving handful who make it to Pakistan, but will not work inside Afghanistan. Another 400,000 or so went to buy ambulances to be used in the Pakistan side of the border, again for the handful they're going to make it. Now, there are already some ambulances operating there, and more wouldn't hurt, but there are no ambulances inside Afghanistan. Camels are the ambulances there. And the remaining few 100,000 was distributed to various international committees to be distributed inside Afghanistan. And of course, we have no way of knowing whether it made it or not. I'd like to think so, since it was given to the Swedish committee and the French doctors. But the French have pretty much pulled out of Afghanistan. They were thoroughly intimidated after the Abu Shart affair, when the Soviet ambassador to Pakistan announced in a public press conference that hereafter the Soviets will simply shoot any journalist or doctor that they find in Afghanistan as an American spy. And the French forthwith pulled out of Afghanistan. So we have only a handful of doctors working in there now. We're trying very hard to get the American doctors set up in there. And I guess we're going to have to give up on it, because the State Department has said absolutely not. You are going to be allowed to set up a training facility in Pakistan, and that's it. And I guess we're going to have to bow to that and do that, because that's certainly better than not being able to do anything for the Afghans. And if we can train medics in Pakistan to work inside Afghanistan for their people, and so be it. But so it looks like the State Department's won one on this one. But we'll keep fighting. The Afghans need help of every sort, and we're not going to give up on it.
Does your committee have any friends in the State Department?
No, they were all purged in the December purge. We had quite a few conservative friends there, including one who was very close to Schultz himself. But last December, you may have read about it in the papers, all of the ideological conservatives were purged from the State Department. Schultz apparently went to President Reagan and said, if you don't give me a free hand over who works for me in the State Department, I'll quit. And the President doesn't seem to ever call anybody's bluff on things like this. And so he said, okay, George, you can have a free hand. And all of the presidential appointees in the State Department were purged and replaced by Schultz's people who are foreign service professionals. So we pretty well lost our network in the state that used to keep us informed of all the machinations going on behind the scenes.
So now we have to make bricks without straw.
Yes, basically.
We don't even have somebody to say, we can get to that person, we can send them mail, we can...
No, we know who it is, but they're not elected officials, so they're invulnerable to public pressure. And as for they're fearing that the president will be hurt by negative public opinion, presidents come and go. These guys are there for 30-year careers. And liberalism and wimpism are ideologies in the State Department. And they wouldn't be particularly concerned to see a conservative president or a conservative member of Congress injured or hurt by negative publicity.
You would think that the conservative branch or the president or those who are there would have long ago realized that to get anything done in an administration, you've got to change who's in the departments. You've got to put your people in.
Well, the president could have had the opportunity. You know, Machiavelli wasn't all bad. And he had some very good ideas, and one of them was strike swiftly and ruthlessly, and everybody will forget about it shortly after. And you remove all your opposition, then you don't ever have to worry about them again. The President had the opportunity when he came to office 5 years ago to fire everybody in the State Department, the CIA, and the Pentagon, and start rehiring on a selective basis. And when he didn't do that immediately on taking office, of course, most of these people are protected by civil service or foreign service regulations. Once hired, you can hardly be fired from civil service. You have to be guilty of some awful bad crime. And those awful bad crimes don't include condemning entire nations to slavery to the Soviets.
And they don't include treason?
Apparently not. I think treason is a word that's gone out of our lexicon. I would very much like to see the word treason come back. I'd like to see Jane Fonda tried retroactively, and other people tried in absentia or post-mortem or whatever for treason. There were a lot of good things that used to be, like gunboat diplomacy and brinksmanship and so forth, that worked. And now we consider them to be things that you mustn't talk about. I was real disappointed. There was a phenomenal Heritage Foundation forum a couple weeks ago titled "How the State Department is Subverting Ronald Reagan's Foreign Policy."
What a title.
Wasn't it that? And of course it was standing room only. People were sitting on the floor and everything. The Washington Post was even there. And it was a 2 solid hour block. They had 3 former Reagan ambassadors, Reagan-appointed ambassadors to one country or another who had been fired. With the exception of Charlie Lichtenstein. He resigned in disgust. He was Jeane Kirkpatrick's deputy at the UN. And one of them had been our ambassador to Costa Rica and one to Romania. And basically all 3 of these have been purged under pressure. But they, to a man, said, let's fire George Shultz and so forth. And to a man, in talking about Nicaragua, saying that the President must take the harshest measures possible to protect our interests there and to support the Nicaraguan Freedom Fighters, whom the Soviets call Contras, and all of this. And then each of them, like the President, then hastened to say, but oh no, we must never use military force. Well, why not? That's what military force is there for, and it's a very effective tool. And as soon as you reassure your enemy that you're never going to use military force, he is free to do whatever the hell he wants. And by the President and these respected conservative leaders saying, oh, we'll never recommend military force, we have given away our whole deck of cards to the other side. I'm all in favor of a return to prudent gunboat diplomacy, of prudent use of military force. Otherwise, if you fear to use the power you've got, the enemy is going to run roughshod over you, as they have for many years. We went into Korea with a limited objective. We went into Vietnam with a no-win policy. Everything else we do is with a no-win policy. Our NATO policy for many years, which was top secret at the time, was a no-win policy. NATO's philosophy, NATO's policy, the American policy in Europe was push the Russians back to the border, the Iron Curtain, and pursue them no further. No strikes in depth. No destruction of the enemy's war-making capability. No destruction of his rear areas or his supply trains. Do not strike in depth. Only push them back and close the door. And they won't come in another door or the window or something. Well, how defeatist can you get? Well, fortunately, that's gone out the window, and our Army policy now, our Army doctrine teaches force in depth. And this is the only way you can fight a war. Well, right now, we've been at war, as President Reagan says, for 40 years. On the other hand, we don't have a draft, because the President says you don't need a draft in peacetime. Well, if we're at war, we need a draft, because this is not peacetime. And we ought to be striking at the enemy with everything we've got. And the way we can do that, short of hitting him head-on with our military forces, and I don't recommend any preemptive strikes with combat troops, because, as I said before, we're not going to be able to fight a conventional war head-on with the Soviets. They've got landlines of communication almost everywhere in the world that we're threatened. We're going to have to go across half the world by sea or by air to meet them where they can walk to. And it would be very stupid, very foolhardy to meet them head-on. And in any case, Sun Tzu, the great Chinese unconventional warfare and psychological warfare specialist, said, the way to get from A to B is not necessarily in a straight line. You go around this way or that way. Well, the Soviets, while holding us in nuclear terror, nuclear blackmail all these years, have been not ashamed or not too shy to move around the world, subverting friendly governments, taking over friendly governments from within, which is what they tried in Afghanistan and failed, which is why they had to invade themselves and take over. They're not at all ashamed to run proxy wars of national liberation and so forth. Well, it's high time that we developed a national strategy of supporting anti-Soviet, anti-communist, pro-democracy freedom movements. In the same way the Soviets sponsor international terrorism, international communism, international wars of liberation. It's a strategy that we don't seem to be capable of coming to grips with. We're just too nice of guys in this country. You remember Secretary Stimson, I believe it was, opposed the creation of the CIA because he sniffed that gentlemen don't read other gentlemen's mail. And we still have been unable to come to grips here with anything like psychological warfare or unconventional warfare or special forces. Well, I'm a guerrilla to the marrow of my bones, and I think it's perfectly honorable. Women have always been taught to fight with whatever tools God gave them, since we don't have control of the establishment. If it means kicking them in the shins with your high heels, then let's do it. And I think we were born to be guerrilla fighters, because we have to use what few weapons we have at our disposal. And well, America has very much become a woman in international affairs and in the military sense. So if we were to develop a strategy, a coordinated strategy, seeing the world as a seamless web, as a seamless piece of fabric, as the Soviets do, for them the world is a giant pipe organ, and they play it like a pipe organ. And we are specialists. We're unable to see anything as being related to anything else. To us, Nicaragua is not Afghanistan, is not Cambodia. To the Soviets it is. So our way of dealing with the threat is to run around trying to cap these little puffs of steam that come out of the pipe organ. And you get diplomatic whiplash trying to do that. You're running back and forth trying to cap these little pipes. And we never have had the sense to go after this organ master with his sheet of music playing this pipe organ. And we've got to learn to do that. We've got to see the world not as isolated, unrelated crisis and hotspots, but as all part of a grand strategy, on our part as well as the Soviets' part. And we were trying to do that in kind of a private basis in Jamba a few weeks ago. I went to Jamba in the bush of Angola with Lou Lehrman and a few other people. We had there the representatives of the Angolan Freedom Fighters, the Afghan Freedom Fighters, the Nicaraguans. The Cambodians sent a letter. They couldn't make it out of their war. And we had the Lao there. This is the first time in history that the enemies of the Soviet Union have sat down around a table and said, by God, let's get together, brother, and let's fight them together. United we stand. And they signed the Jamba Declaration, forming the Democracy International. This was done with the sponsorship of Citizens for America, Lou Lehrman's group in our building, the other CFA in America. And it was really a dramatic and exciting event, and if we could just make it work. But there we were, sitting in Jamba, in the bush of Angola, in these little grass huts, thousands of miles from anywhere, surrounded by hostile countries and Russian soldiers and Cuban soldiers and everything else, doing this wonderful, great, magnificent thing. We had a letter from President Reagan to the freedom fighters. Mr. Reagan was saying, I'm with you guys. You're where it's at. You're what it's all about. At the same time, his State Department was in Luanda, the capital of Angola, negotiating a new aid treaty with the Marxist regime there. Where is the logic and rationale in all
Why
of this?
doesn't he know?
I don't know. I don't know if he knows or not. I don't know if he just thinks it kind of cute, or if he says, that's George, my boy, or what. The same thing with, we don't have Africa on here, with Mozambique. That country is the closest to being overthrown by its internal popular resistance movement of any communist country in the world. Right down there in little old Mozambique. The freedom fighters there are called Renamo. It's right on the edge of being overthrown by Renamo. But now the South Africans, I believe with State Department pressure, have signed an agreement with the Marxist regime cutting off South African support to Renamo. We cut off aid to Jonas Savimbi, that wonderful, dynamic leader, yes, with the Clark Amendment. Pulled the rug out from him, forced him into the arms of the South Africans, and then condemned him for taking aid from the South Africans. Now we have forced the South Africans to cut off aid to Renamo, and we're not going to give it to them, so where are they going to get it, these anti-communist freedom fighters in Mozambique?
Why did the South Africans give in to that?
I don't know. It's international politics. They're under a lot of pressure from the United States, especially from Congress. But at the same time that Renamo's been cut off, the State Department has signed a military aid package deal with the Marxist regime in Mozambique so that they can crush the now almost disarmed Renamo fighters. Renamo's not going to get any more outside aid, and now we're giving the Marxists there military aid to crush Renamo. At the same time, the Soviets are still shipping Mi-24 helicopters to Renamo.
You know that the majority of American people today, if it was explained to them and shown to them, would be totally against that.
Well, sure, but they don't get the story from the media, and it's very hard to get the word to them.
You look at the front page of the LA Times, it's never there.
Well, look at the example of what happened in Nicaragua recently. You remember the big flap over whether the Soviets had shipped MiGs to Nicaragua. If those crates on those boats contained MiGs, the United States was going to stamp its foot and say, don't you ever do that again. And that's what Jimmy Carter used to do, and we learned very well from him. And you know, it was a huge moment of tension as we watched these ships, these big crates on the decks get closer and closer to Nicaragua. We'd drawn the line in the dust. It was going to be war. We were going to blockade Nicaragua, blockade Cuba, blockade somebody if those crates contained MiGs. And the State Department and the media and the President and Congress and everybody heaved a huge sigh of relief that the crisis had been averted. Those crates only contained the Mi-24 Hind helicopter, the most lethal weapon system in the world today. One Hind helicopter, one Mi-24, can level an entire village in minutes. It's rocket power, it's machine gun power, it's chemical warfare delivery capability power, it's bomb power. Is just mind-boggling. One Mi-24 is a flying tank. You can't shoot it out of the air with an anti-tank weapon because of the aerodynamic shape of the hull. And you can't shoot it down with a conventional anti-aircraft machine gun. The only thing you'll get is a heat-seeking missile, which you can be sure the Contras don't have. You can be sure the Afghans don't have them, or the Cambodians, or anybody else facing
all
the
these
Mi-24.
people who heave their sigh of relief know exactly what a Hind is.
They certainly ought to. If they don't, they're worse bloody damn fools than I take them for. But they had drawn their line in the dust, and they had specified MiGs, and since it was something much worse than MiGs, that didn't matter. It wasn't MiGs. And,
because they really don't want to fight, because they don't have the spine.
That's right.
Because they will not go all the way and say, I will give my life to this cause. And if you're not willing to give your life to something you stand for, then you're going to fall short, because someone else is willing to give his life, and that's the enemy. So now we're going to open this to questions, and by way of answering a question, you can show your slides. And I guess we'll take our question right here.
Karen, I understand that the Soviets are shipping Afghan children by the thousands up to the Soviet Union for indoctrination. Is this truly taking place, and what is the extent of it? And the secondary question is that we understood this last tremendous attack up in the Panjshir, and a lot of really genocide taking place. And I heard the other day in the press that a lot of the Soviet army has been trapped, and now they're having to actually get their men out, the troops out by helicopter, and that the Afghans are systematically, pouring fire into that area. Would you like to comment on that?
I sure would. I mentioned earlier the Soviets' war of terror against the Afghan people. The most precious legacy of any nation is its children. It's the future of a nation. It's tomorrow. Without children, there is no tomorrow. And in Afghanistan, the war against the children has taken a number of forms. The toy bombs, little Nabib here. A little girl named Sabra that I found up on the border of Afghanistan. She had been wounded 4 months before and was just now coming over the border to help. There were 4 children in her group, and they were the only surviving children from that village. Sabra thought that she was picking up a toy bird, and it blew off both of her hands, and the flame took away her left eye and her scalp, and when the veil fell away from her head, she had no hair, not even skin. The cranium was showing. And her left eye was just a massive blue-white scar tissue. This is part of the Soviet war against the Afghans. The other part of it are things like this. As you said, the Soviets are deporting children to the Soviet Union for forced communist indoctrination. Tens of thousands of children from the age of 6 up have been taken forcibly from their homes, forcibly from their families, to the Soviet Union for what will be 10 to 20 years of communist indoctrination. And, you know, this is depriving a nation of its legacy, of its future, of its tomorrow. The Soviets have done this in many places. This is an old Soviet tactic. In Greece, during the Civil War there in 1945 through 48, 10,000 Greek children were kidnapped from their families and never seen again. When I was living in Israel, my daughter's pediatrician was a Hungarian doctor, the only Hungarian Jew that ever got out of Hungary after the war. And his father had been the pediatrician in the camp for the deported Greek children. And when Greece did not fall to communism, those children were dispersed throughout the communist bloc. And I'd met many Greek families who'd lost their children during that time and never knew if they were alive or dead or had been taken away. And right now in Cuba, you've got 10,000 Angolan children cutting sugar cane. That's one of the hardest slave labor jobs in life, is cutting sugar cane. Read the Thornbirds and description there of cutting sugar cane. It kills grown men. And 10,000 Angolan children are there ostensibly for education, working as slave laborers in the sugar fields. These Afghan children are still being taken by the plane load. Sometimes their parents know they're being taken. There have been tearful scenes at the airport filmed for communist propaganda on Soviet television of the happy Afghan parents crying tears for joy at being able to send their children off to a higher form of life and to learn to be good communists. And what they don't show are the guns that are trained on these people, and they'll be shot if they make a move to try and get their child back. I met a little boy who's 11 years old now. His name was Naim. Naim means nice or beautiful or pleasant in Arabic and Hebrew. Naim, at the age of 9, had been taken to the Soviet Union for 6 months of indoctrination as a saboteur, assassin, and spy. And the first 3 months of his education there, he was one of a group of 1,000 children in this group. The first 3 months of these children, they were ages 9 to 12, all boys and girls, was to break down anything of their culture that remained. You know, the Islamic culture is like the Orthodox Christian or Jewish or Muslim or whatever culture. It's a very demanding culture with very stringent rules governing how you live and you know, very carefully controlling sex and alcohol and so forth. Well, the first 3 months of these children's education in Soviet Union was to break down their Islamic culture. The boys were forced to go to bed with grown women, Russian women. The girls were forced to go to bed with grown Russian men. All of these were KGB personnel. They all wore uniforms in the classroom and such. The children were forced to drink beer with their lunch and vodka with their dinner in great quantities and forced to smoke cigarettes. So they became addicted to tobacco, alcohol, and sex in that 3-month period. And if a child tried to run away from sleeping with a man or a woman or something, they were beaten and sent back in. And then after the 3 months of this, to break down their culture, then they were sent to another place where they got their military training. They were trained to use all forms of weapons, knives, handguns, rifles, explosives, to make time bombs, to make plastic explosives to blow up buildings and bridges and so forth. They were trained how to pretend that they were homeless children whose parents had been killed by the Russians, and to walk up to Mujahideen and say, help me, please. I want to live with you. The nasty Russians killed my parents. And then they would go back and report on the Mujahid's strength and positions and so forth, assassinate them if they could. Naim was responsible for the death of a lot of good people before he was caught. He was caught trying to assassinate a group of Mujahideen in their mountain stronghold, and his gun jammed. And he ran away, and the Mujahideen went after him and caught him and took him to Peshawar. When I met him, he'd been in captivity for a year now, and the Afghans were trying to turn him back into a good Afghan. He sized me up for what I don't know, but he looked me up and down as we talked. We talked for about 6 or 8 hours, and it was quite a story. And I think you'll read it next month in Reader's Digest, because John Barron was with me on that trip. But Naim was a typical case of how the Soviets are using the children of Afghanistan as a weapon, either to destroy them with toy bombs or massive bombings of cities. Right now there's a little boy, 8 years old, in a hospital in Salt Lake City. We brought him in at the beginning of May with 3 other wounded freedom fighters. This little boy lost his mother and his legs in a bombing of his village. His legs were crushed by his house when it fell and killed his mother and most of his brothers and sisters. For 9 months, that little boy had no medical attention, and they brought him on a donkey for 7 days to Peshawar. And there the doctors said, we can't help him. He had gangrene, severe malnutrition, infections, all kinds of side effects from having been wounded full 9 months before. And they sent him to us. We brought him out on our airlift. And it was nip and tuck. He was in critical condition all the way. And we met the plane in New York. He woke up a couple of times while we were changing planes, and he smiled this biggest, broadest smile, just like the sunshine breaking through clouds. And he says, I'm going to get well, and I'm going to go back. My father's a freedom fighter, and I'm going to go back and fight. He never said, I hurt, I'm in pain, I'm thirsty, I'm hungry. He just said, I'm going to go back and fight. 10 minutes out of Salt Lake, this little boy, his name is Hazrat Khan, 10 minutes out of Salt Lake, his heart stopped. And my assistant, Mary Spencer, administered CPR to him all through the landing. Plane stopped at the tarmac, the ambulance rolled up alongside, the crew came onto the emergency exits, everybody stayed on the plane quiet, waiting for this drama to play through. They got the IV and the oxygen into him and got him to the hospital. That was the beginning of May. Hazrat Khan isn't going to make it. His kidneys have failed. He was never strong enough to be operated on. And he's going to have to be sent back to Afghanistan to die because that hospital bed is needed for some other freedom fighter that we might be able to save. That's called triage in the Army, the selection of who will make it and who won't. And it's brutal, but it's necessary because to save somebody else's life, Hazrat Khan is going to have to go home to die because he's going to die here. And the Soviets wanted that to happen to that little boy, even though it was an impersonal bombing of his village. That village was bombed in retaliation for freedom fighter activities elsewhere. It's just, one more case of violations of Geneva Conventions because Geneva law forbids bombing of villages in retaliation.
So this child, is he conscious now?
He's conscious, and he still says he's going to get well, and he's going to go back and fight. God works miracles, and the last we heard was that he was rallying, and his kidneys were beginning to hold a little bit of protein, and maybe, if everybody prays for Hazrat Khan, maybe he'll make it. But we're having to make the decision now. And on my next trip over there to pick up more wounded, I hope I don't have to take that little boy back until he's well.
You have really touched our hearts with these stories today.
Oh, listen, when I have to go over there and see these, I close my eyes at night and I can't get those children out of my eyes. The little baby, I found a 7-month-old baby up on the border, just coming across with the refugees. She was 7 months old when her mother was killed by the bombing when she was 4 months old. They kept her alive all this time by chewing meat, spitting it into a cloth, and then squeezing the drippings into her mouth to try to get some nutrients into her. And her belly like a beach ball, and her arms and legs were like pipe stems, and her head was huge, and she had the eyes of a 45-year-old woman in her head. Just eyes that burned through your soul when she looked at you, and covered with scabs. And that was in late March, early April. And she wouldn't live another month because the hot season was coming on, and most of the children in the camps in Pakistan die in the first year because they can't tolerate the climate and the diseases and the lack of sanitation. That child had kwashiorkor, which is something you associate with Africa, not with Afghanistan.
But the eyes tell you the soul.
The eyes, oh God, I've got pictures of that child. But it's it's something that's hard to live with. That's why I can't give up this job. I sympathize with George Washington. All he wanted to do was stay home on the farm. And, and he kept having to leave the farm to serve his country. And all I want to do is stay home with my kids and my husband and my dogs and my horses and do this more and more. But you can't walk out on these people. I'm as hooked as if they were a drug, because you can't walk out on them. They're so courageous. They can't walk out on their war. And Kathleen, I'm sure, would rather go back and do something else. And I know Mary Spencer says, I don't want to do anything more to do with Washington after this is over. And we all hang in there because it's a war that we cannot walk out on.
I just want to ask you one more question. Sure. The little boy that you talked to for many hours, who had been indoctrinated by the Soviets, did he show any signs of coming around?
Well, sometimes. The Mujahideen said that sometimes he seems like he's shaping up, and then he'll vanish. And without a penny in his pocket, he'll show up a day later, 800 miles away, in their office in another city, saying, here I am. You know, he still has a capability of doing absolutely anything.
I thought he was in
stolen their
custody.
weapons. Yeah, he is, but it's a very loose kind of custody. You know, he's free to come and go. They're trying to put him in school. They're trying to do, you know, all kinds of things with him. But, you know, there's no such thing as putting a child in jail among the freedom fighters. You know, that's what the Soviets do. So what they're trying to do is teach him by example, and they've got him in Pakistan. He could go back into Afghanistan tomorrow. But if he did, the Russians would catch him because he's been interviewed now by a couple of reporters and photographed, and his identity is known, and the unit that he was assigned to, the children's unit, you know, the Soviets have children's units, and his commander, whoever that Soviet officer is in Kandahar, knows that he's in Pakistan, and if he were to go back into Afghanistan, they'd kill him.
How old is he?
He's 11 now. Yeah, real little runny guy, you know. A little runt, shaved head, and cute as can be. Great big mischievous smile. He looks like he'd have a slingshot sticking out of his pocket and a fishing pole and pulling a tail on a cat or something, not assassinating men.
Let me just show us your slides, the rest of your slides.
Okay, what I want to show you are just, you know, the kind of thing that what Afghanistan means to us and what we want to go back to. This is what Afghanistan used to be. Those are the doves of peace in a magnificent ancient mosque in Mazar Sharif. It's probably leveled now because the Soviets have destroyed almost all the mosques. You know, they're doing to Afghanistan what the Nazis did to the Jews and the synagogues and the churches, destroying them. I've got a haunting picture of two old men holding in a turban the torn scraps of a Koran that they swept up off the floor of a destroyed mosque somewhere in Afghanistan. And the Soviets, I don't see any difference between a communist and a Nazi myself. I think you go far enough right and you meet the left, dead center on the opposite side of good. And this, though, is a symbol of what Afghanistan was and what it must be allowed to return to, what it must be allowed to become again. That mosque was probably 1,000 years old, probably dated back to the early time of the Mongols and the white doves and all. And you can be sure that's all gone now because Mazar Sharif has really taken it in the chops, and the civilian population has mostly been killed off or driven out. And most of the cities have been leveled, and all of these beautiful architectural gems. We know that Herat, which was a historical dream, a historical treasure, hardly has a stone left on top of a stone. All the archaeological architectural masterpieces are gone. Same with Kandahar and other places. Look at this little girl with her little baby goat. You know, they have so much courage and so much hope. It's an elusive dream there, but they're not going to give up fighting. And this little girl, if her country isn't free today by her parents, she'll grow up to be a fighter tomorrow. You know, they're raising generations now of fighters in the refugee camps. Kids who don't know the alphabet because the schools have all been destroyed, and we haven't been able to get them enough support to reestablish their school. That's one of the Mujahideen's high priorities, is to get a school system established again and liberate Afghanistan. And 90% of Afghanistan is held by the freedom fighters, subject only to constant aerial bombardment and chemical attacks and so forth. But on the ground, they're free, and they can hold their own. You asked me earlier about this Konar business. Soviets sent 20,000 troops into Konar a few weeks ago, the largest Soviet offensive since World War II, to try to destroy the resistance. And the resistance did to them what they do in the Panjshir. There have been 9 attempts to destroy the Panjshir Valley. They do to the Soviets what the Russians did to Napoleon and to Hitler. They just withdrew and let the countryside absorb the momentum of the thrust. And when the Soviet supply line got strung out, they moved in a multiple pincers movement and scooped them up. And in the Konar Valley, the mouth of the valley is so narrow that once they fell upon the Soviet force in that valley and the Soviets tried to beat a retreat out of the valley, they found it bottled up. It's like Thermopylae, where a handful of men can hold off an army. And they're systematically wiping them out. And what was left of the Soviet force there was airlifted out by helicopter, leaving behind all their equipment. So the Mujahideen will be considerably better equipped for the next month's fighting. But that little girl is what it's all about. She's the future, and she's what the Soviets are trying to destroy. And if we're going to help these people, we're going to help them get up out of the dirt and fight on their hind legs and continue to fight on their hind legs as they have been. You know, the nice thing about the Afghans, unlike the Hungarians and the Czechs and the Cubans, we pulled the rug out from under those other freedom movements. The Hungarian Revolution lasted a matter of days. The Czech Revolution went down without a shot being fired. The Bay of Pigs was betrayed. by us, by John Kennedy. And the Afghans didn't learn from any of that. They learned from their spirit and from their mountains and from their God and from their history. 5,000 years they've never been conquered, never been successfully occupied. They don't intend to start now, so they have no history of subjugation. They have no history of giving in or quitting or of surrendering or of accepting a foreign rule. And they just keep fighting. I just love this little girl. And that's the glory of Afghanistan, those mountains, worth divisions to the freedom fighters, worth being free. It's, you know, that's God's country. It's like the Sinai in ways. You know, have you ever heard Nikos Kazantzakis and his reports of visiting Palestine and Lebanon and Egypt in the 1930s, and speaking of the Sinai as that God-hewn wilderness, Jehovah thundering through the passes and all. Afghanistan gives you that feeling too. It's a country where God is very present, and if you ask the freedom fighters how empty-handed, barefooted, empty-bellied they've held out for so long against the mightiest superpower on earth that's been throwing at them the world's most advanced weapon systems, including laser-guided weapon systems and chemical and biological warfare and the helicopter gunship and all, they say simply, they shrug and they say, God's doing it. And there can't be any other answer for it. Because certainly no other people in the world have been able to stand up to the Soviets and kick mud in their eye and continue to do it with impunity for so long. But, you know, I've often been asked in 5 years how long the Afghans can hold out. And I always say, well, the smart guy said they'd be over within a week, like Czechoslovakia and Hungary, and they're still fighting. And never before would I give any prediction. But I think this summer is going to be the watershed, this summer and this coming winter, because Afghanistan has lost half its population. And how long can a people that has been decimated like that and are being subjected to such a war of terror, how long before they break? Through sheer attrition, through sheer numbers. That war of terror has got to ultimately someday demoralize them. It hasn't yet. But the abuse of their women and children, the Soviets know that the women and children are the most sacred treasures of the Afghan people. And the raping of women and the defiling of women is something that a Muslim cannot tolerate. More so than in America. You know, here we take it as another crime. And only the women's movement gets outraged about it, and women in general. But society as a whole just sees it as another crime, and, you know, so what? But the Afghans, that is like defiling God. And it's something they can't take. And I feel that if we don't get them effective aid, it's soon going to be too late. And those mountains will be painted red forever, you know, as long as the Soviet Empire lasts.
And one of the greatest races of people the world has ever known will be effectively leveled.
Effectively, yes. This is genocide. You know, genocide is the destruction of a genus. That's what the Nazis tried to do to the Jews, and the Cambodians did to themselves. And in the case of the Afghans, there being so few of them to start with and so few of them left, they may well disappear from the face of the earth if we don't get them some help. But so long as they fight, they're free. So long as they fight, the flame of liberty burns in that land. And so long as the flame of liberty burns in Afghanistan, we're all free. But as long as any man anywhere in the world is not free, none of us are. And, you know, for that reason alone, we got to help the Afghans. We got to support them, because, like John Kennedy said, "Ich bin ein Berliner." We are Afghans, and they're fighting our war as well as their own.
That's right.
Both morally and strategically.
That's right. Question. Great.
I'd like to go back to the point where you're talking about well-equipped Afghan freedom fighters. If we do equip the Afghans, or they're able to equip themselves somehow, what would you look for in terms of military action in Afghanistan vis-a-vis the Soviets? And then what would be the political ramification for the Soviet Empire?
You mean if the Afghans had adequate weapons,
Right.
what would happen then in the war?
Right.
Well, there we've got to get into the realm of speculation. A lot of people say, well, we can't give the Afghans anything because the Soviets will just step up the war, they'll pour more men in there and so forth. Well, what on earth can they do to the Afghans they aren't doing already? So I think it's a risk well worth taking. And as far as pouring more men in there, the Soviet logistic train is going to be strained eventually. And so what if they pour 500,000 men in there? That's what it's going to take. They got 250,000 in there now, although the State Department still insists that it's about 105,000. They've always kept the estimates very low, and have casualties too. it's anybody's guess, but my guess is that the Soviets will be defeated, forced to withdraw from Afghanistan in ignominious defeat, as we were from Vietnam. And when people say, well, you can't beat the Soviets, well, we were defeated in Vietnam largely by ourselves. We were defeated in the front pages of American newspapers and in the halls of Congress and in the universities. But we were, nonetheless, defeated. And we pulled out. And we can inflict something like that on the Soviets through the Afghans. I shouldn't put it that way, because then people will accuse me of fighting to the last drop of Afghan blood, which Selig Harrison has already tried to do. That was the title of one of his stories. Karen McKay will fight to the last drop of Afghan blood. And, you know, one thing that the least that we can do is increase the Soviet pucker factor by adding anti-aircraft weapons in there in any kind of significant supply. The most that can happen is the defeat of the Soviet Empire. But I think what will happen, though, is if we couple aid to the Afghans with diplomatic, political, and economic support to them from the outside, which is essential because no guerrilla movement ever won a conventional victory. At some point they have to go conventional, and every guerrilla movement's got to have outside support in order to succeed, and that's got to be diplomatic, political, and economic support. If we couple all these things together, I think the pressure can be raised to the point where the Soviets will say, all right, we'll negotiate. We'll negotiate a face-saving withdrawal. That happened in Iran 3 times in a century. 3 times this century, the Soviets annexed huge chunks of Iran. And through their invasion of Afghanistan and preparing to do it again, only this time probably the whole country. They were forced to give up Austria. They were forced to give up Greece. They were forced to give up Finland. But that was all back when America was strong and wasn't afraid to use its power and might. Now we're going to have to do it through our friends, the people who are begging us for help. And I think that probably the most reasonable thing to hope for would be that by increasing the military pressure on them massively inside Afghanistan, while keeping up the diplomatic, political, and economic pressure on them from the outside, they will come to the negotiating table in good faith. Not as they are doing today in the UN negotiations, which are a complete farce. They are using the UN negotiations to give themselves a fig leaf of legitimacy and to build a smokescreen behind which they're entrenching in Afghanistan. They are building 6 or 8 of the most dangerous long-range offensive bases in the world in Afghanistan. Shindan is on its way to becoming the most sophisticated military base in the world. And that's only about 60 miles from the Iranian border. And it's a combined arms army base. It's got tanks and motorized rifles and helicopters and long-range bombers and fighter bombers and long-range transport aircraft and so forth. And they're digging in there. But there are another 6 or 8 bases being built that threaten Pakistan, India, and China. And then they've got more than 30 more bases on the northern side of the mountains. And they're preparing to cut Afghanistan in half. They've been floating this diplomatically lately, trying to get me to play the game in Congress to cut Afghanistan in half like a North and South Korea. And they would move the capital from Kabul to Mazar-i-Sharif, which there's evidence they're preparing to do now, because they can defend Mazar-i-Sharif. They can't defend Kabul. And then they would have a North and South Afghanistan that's more manageable for them, and then they can go after the South after consolidating the North, as they did in Vietnam and try to do in Korea. But with sufficient weaponry and food and medicine and clothing and shelter and so forth to the Afghans, I think we can force the Soviets to the negotiating table where they will willingly, as they did in Austria, Iran, and Finland, negotiate their way out. But their terms right now for negotiated settlement are totally unacceptable to the Afghans or to any decent American or Pakistani. And the Paks have rejected it, and the Afghans have rejected it, and we should too.
Right. Now, if the Soviets withdraw from Afghanistan, what happens to the rest of Eastern Europe? Is there any ramifications there to the Poles or the
Czechs? I think that you know, if their withdrawal from Afghanistan is forced into a deadbeat retreat, hell for leather, pell-mell escape, that the captive world, which has been waiting for years, hungering for freedom, longing to throw off this yoke of communist tyranny, will rise up. Because all they've been waiting for is the opportunity. Nobody wants to be a slave. The deepest, most basic yearning of any human being is freedom. And to believe that the Ukrainians and the Lithuanians and the Hungarians like being under the heel of oppression is the most stupid naivety in the world, which of course our State Department suffers from in a terminal case. But yeah, it could be the beginning of the end of the Soviet Empire.
Thank you.
Well, that was a rather long-winded response to a simple question. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
You were talking about Selig Harrison before, and I remember seeing him on television, and I guess he's written a book about Afghanistan, and he says that if we give aid to the Afghans that can be traced to us, then it will make the Soviets invade Pakistan, and it will be really terrible. What would be your answer to that?
Well, Selig Harrison is the most tireless beater of the Soviet drum that we have in America, and the guy so ready glows. And he is always coming up with one cockamamie explanation or another why we shouldn't aid the Afghans. The Soviets are going to invade Pakistan anyway if they decide to do it. What they would prefer to do is what they do successfully everywhere else in the world, is to subvert Pakistan through internal coups, to dismember Pakistan from within. You know, there's already trouble in Sindh, there's trouble in Punjab, there's trouble in Balochistan. That doesn't leave very much of Pakistan left. And I think that that's what they would be more likely to do while keeping on military pressure. But you never know what the Soviets are going to do. The smart guys in the morning of December 27, 1979, were reassuring President Carter that the Soviets would never invade Afghanistan, despite what he saw in the satellite pictures, despite the fact that there were convoys lined up at 3 points on the Soviet border with Afghanistan pointed south, despite the fact that the most elite Soviet paratroopers had already been airlifted into Afghanistan a week before, and the invasion had been on for 2 weeks, aircraft landing every 3 minutes at Bagram Air Base, and so forth. The smart guy said, "Don't worry, Mr. President. The Soviets would never do anything stupid like that. They might risk our wrath," and so forth. And of course, it had already been done. It became manifest that afternoon when they stormed the presidential palace and murdered Amin and all those people. Pakistan recognizes this. You don't buy your security by appeasing the enemy. You don't buy your security by feeding the crocodile, because pretty soon he's going to get hungry again. And what we've been doing is throwing the crocodile at our friends, hoping that he'll be full up by the time he gets to us. And I have absolutely no use for Selig Harrison. He claims to be an expert in Afghanistan affairs, and he has very little on which to base that claim. And I believe his only trip to Afghanistan was as a guest of the Babrak Karmal government last year. I'm not aware of any previous trips to Afghanistan. He is an Iranian expert, I believe. I think he's been there. But Babrak Karmal invited him for a couple of weeks, gave him a guided tour, and Selig came back saying, "Oh, it's just wonderful what the Russians have done to that lousy country. It's just great. There are flowers growing everywhere now, and people are happy, and women have been liberated, and people are being taught to read and write." And Babrak Karmal is such a jolly fellow, and so on and so forth. The Newsweek reporter got the same treatment and claimed the war was over and that everything was hunky-dory. You can't believe much that you read that Selig Harrison writes anymore. You can believe what the Soviets write.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good afternoon, Karen. I really have 2 questions. The first one is in regard to the momentum that you talked about that could be built up if this wonderful people, the Afghanistans, were able to get aid from us and were able to fight off the Russian oppression. That perhaps then the people behind the rest of the Iron Curtain would be able to rise up and do their part in overthrowing this oppression. You mentioned that if this happened, this could be the end of the Russian oppression for the world and the threat of the Russians that could very often be argued by people in this country, that if we do anything at all to aid the Afghanistans, that we are endangering ourselves for a nuclear threat. To use your words, the nuclear blackmail would be put into effect. What would you say to people that have that argument, number one? And number two, do you think it could also go the other way? Do you think that if we don't aid the people of Afghanistan, that we possibly could be undoing ourselves and it could be the end of us?
Yes, to your last one. To your first one, have you ever noticed that whenever the Soviets do something nasty in the world, and we even talk about taking some action in response to Soviet action that we are accused of threatening World War III. Nobody ever accuses the Soviets of threatening World War III with their actions. They are considered by the world to be some kind of an uncontrollable, uninfluenceable natural force that, like earthquakes and tornadoes and all of that, that you just have to live with, and you know, have no mind and no leverage or button or anything else you can push to do anything in response to it. You can't stop an earthquake with a speeding bullet, or you can't stop a Soviet imperialistic advance with a speeding bullet. So that's your response, was how come we're always accused of threatening World War III by responding to a Soviet aggressive action, and they're not. There's not much else here, because people have a mentality like that. These unilateral disarmers and the appeasers and all of that really are never going to be swayed much by any logical argument. You have to give them something facetious, I think, that almost ridicules them, because these people just, you know, I don't know what they've got between their ears, but it's not gray matter. It's cotton candy or something. And some of them are so open-minded, their brains fell out a long time ago. And you just, they're, you know, when you're trying to argue something with a woolly-minded liberal, it's hopeless. Have you ever dropped a thermometer on the floor and tried to pick up that little silver ball that fell out, you know, the mercury? Every time you touch it, it shatters into a million little silver balls, and you go around trying to pick them up, and they swirl around. Well, that's what a liberal's thinking is like. You can never pin them down, because as soon as you try to nail them to the wall, they splutter and run around over here, and you just can't pin them down. You can't pick up their line of logic. I would much rather argue with a hardcore communist anytime, because then you can strike off flint and you can get somewhere, because they're ideologically committed. They're not wimps, and you can talk to them, and then you can use reason and facts and logic and possibly influence them, or at least have a darn good argument. But with liberals, you're just never going to get anywhere. It's very frustrating. It's like the Uncle Remus tar baby that you keep punching, and the more you punch it, the more mired you are in the argument. You're never going to get out of it.
What's interesting to me is the psychology of the liberal. He must be having a very severe case of having to camouflage an enormous fear of facing reality.
Oh, yes. I think you're quite right. The funny thing is that, you know, our liberals tend to be leftists here, if they think that far. And in Europe, the leftist community has come to grips with Afghanistan. In Europe, communism is not a dirty word, but Sovietism is. And the invasion of Afghanistan was a real watershed for the European leftist community, the Euro-communists, the socialists and all. I have testified before the Socialist International. I've been to conferences sponsored by the Italian communists and found myself in complete backslapping agreement with them about the Soviets and about the invasion of Afghanistan. And they are getting up, you know, aid programs and
Why don't
everything
they send
else.
surface-to-air rockets to them?
I don't think they have them. There aren't very many surface-to-air missiles in Europe. The blowpipe is just coming on market. Now that's made by the French and British consortium. And the French are such whores. They'll sell it to anybody who will pay them. And it may be that we can use that that opportunity to get surface-to-air heat-seeking missiles into Afghanistan, because since we know that a French consortium is going to sell them to absolutely anybody, then we can say, well, you know, we don't know where they came from. But until the blowpipe is on the market, that's not a possibility. In any case, I think our State Department will still be afraid to do it. The red eye is now in enough hands that you know, it's in Chad and it's in other countries, and we should be able to send it. It's obsolete in our forces, and we've got them sitting in warehouses. We don't use them anymore. But the liberals, you know, they haven't been able to come to grips with it in this country. The liberal members of Congress are with us, Markey, Hart, Tsongas. But I almost suspect that these are liberals who have a conscience and have a mind, and have been able, you know, I think they call themselves neoliberals, to separate themselves from the woolly-headed liberals, because they're able to think things through and to see things in the sense of good and evil, and that there is a place where you got to fight evil, and they see Afghanistan as a place to do it. But that big liberal community out there, that amorphous mass in America, can't come to grips with it. As I said about Ethiopia, they can't pass off Afghanistan as an act of God or a natural disaster. So therefore they have to avoid confronting it. They have to continue to pull the wool over their own eyes and delude themselves and so forth. The problem that they're eventually going to have to face is that when you stick your head in the sand, your other side's exposed. And maybe one of these days we can find that and kick it a little bit and get them thinking a bit. But the problem is that they're, so hard to find anything of a liberal to to pin down.
I've got to know what other nation in this world has the weapons the Afghans need that we can work on, because we don't have to just stop with the United States.
No country on earth is going to go out on a limb against the Soviets if the arsenal democracy, the second superpower in the world, is not going to be out there first. These people have read the handwriting on the wall, and it's Russian. And everybody, including our NATO allies, is looking at how to find a way to accommodate with the Russians, because they've seen us as a faithless ally. They have seen us as a spineless nation, fearful of using our might. It's like our three good, hardcore, right-wing former ambassadors the other day saying, oh, but we must never recommend military action in Nicaragua. With that kind of a mentality here, what is the use of our having an army? Because we've already reassured everybody in the world that we're never going to use it. So why would any third world nation or any allied nation of ours or any nation that's closer to the Soviets than we are going to get out there and risk making the Russian bear mad at them for a cause that America fears or is too weak or too spineless to support?
Well, let's say, regardless of that position, who has what they need today?
Oh, lots of people. The Israelis, the South Africans, the Russians, the Chinese. Chinese don't have very much of it. Their stuff is really obsolete when it comes off the showroom floor. Because when the Soviets pulled out of China and broke relations, Chinese weapon development stopped at that point.
And China is free to act without us?
Yeah, but their weapons are poor quality, and they lack the means of moving them. And they've done a little, but not nearly enough. And the Afghans don't really like the Chinese weapons they get. For one thing, their machine guns tend to suffer barrel meltdown in any kind of heavy use. So it's, the British, the Europeans, our NATO allies all have,
They all could help.
They all could help, but none of them are going to unless America's going to first. And we have the means of doing it all by ourselves. Now Egypt was helping a great deal, even though Sadat couldn't afford it. But he was helping a great deal because he had huge stocks of Russian weapons that the Afghans could claim they captured from the Russians and protect Sadat. But when he was murdered, that source dried up. Mubarak is trying to reestablish warm and friendly relations with the Soviets, and he can't do that if he's helping to kill Russian soldiers in Afghanistan with Russian-made weapons. So the Egyptian
And what about the whole Muslim world? These are Muslims.
The Islamic unity stops at the borders of the Arab world. And they too have read the handwriting on the wall. And they're a lot closer to the Soviet Union and to the Soviet Empire than we are. And the Saudis, for instance, give generous humanitarian support to the refugees in camps in Pakistan. But not one single penny or bullet or bean or loaf of bread for the people inside Afghanistan. Private Saudi sources, private individuals like you and me, give aid to the Islamic Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood, that is part of the Islamic Revolution, the folks that took out Sadat, and are doing more harm in Afghanistan. These people, it's a small fringe element of Afghans who are fundamentalists, very small fringe element. But they're sponsored by Gaddafi and Khomeini and private Saudi monies, and are fabulously rich, well organized because they have the international leftist experience to organize them. And they go around killing other Afghans, especially ambushing them when they're in battle with the Soviets, or helping the Soviets to bottle them up in a trap, and this sort of thing. Because these Islamic fundamentalists that call themselves Afghans consider the Islamic Revolution to be the primary war, and that the Soviets can be used as an instrument to defeat the kind of Islam that's not their brand. So the Afghans are really fighting a two-front war. They're fighting the Islamic fundamentalists while they're fighting the Russians. And they've decided to deal with the Russians first because that's the most immediate and urgent threat. And when they get the Russians out, then they'll deal with the Islamic fundamentalists in their midst, the Khomeini and Gaddafi and the Soviets themselves are sending in. The Afghans are the first to tell you the Islamic Revolution is not Islamic, it's Soviet. And they'll tell you that Khomeini is a Soviet stooge, a Soviet agent. But they, the Soviets are the more urgent threat. But also the Afghans will tell you that if they had to have their choice between the Russians and the Islamic fundamentalists, they'd take the Russians. Because they say the Russians are not against education, are not against women's rights. They'll just be totalitarian oppressionists. But the Islamic fundamentalists are also going to establish a totalitarian dictatorship, but they are against education and against women's rights. And so of the two evils, they would prefer the Russian to the Islamic fundamentalists.
It's unbelievable.
And, one lady asked me here about, if we can defeat the Russian Empire, if it can be all over with them there, what's next? Well, there will always be evil in the world. There always has been. And we will not be able to put our guns away and go back to raising sheep in this country without any thought for vigilance. Because if we ever defeat international communism as a threat, Islamic fundamentalism, resurgent Islamic militancy, irredentist Islam will be the next threat. And in fact, it is right now, concomitant with the Soviets, and each is using the other. The Soviets think they're using Islam, and Islam thinks it's using the Soviets to wage this revolution against the infidel West, against Western corruption and so forth. So, we're always going to need to have vigilance in this country, a strong defense, be prepared to sacrifice for freedom, because there will always be evil. And I think this is a message that's even starting to be taught now in movies and all that are aimed at children, Star Wars movies, The Dark Crystal, these other fantasy movies that we see, the Time Bandits and so forth. These are all cute kids' fantasies and science fiction and all of that. But there's a message in there. There's an evil that must be defeated by good people willing to do what they must do to be free and to triumph. And I think that there's a very healthy thing in these kind of movies, in that they're a reversal of the spiritual corruption of the 60s and 70s, where we all turned inward and began gazing at our navels and freaking out on flowers. And now we're beginning to teach reality again with these superheroes and all of that. I keep telling my kids that television will rot their minds like candy rots their teeth. And every time I walk in the house, the first thing I do is turn off the television. But nonetheless, in these kind of movies that are coming out, and these kind of programs where good battles evil, I think there's a useful and healthy message in that evil's always out there in one form or another, and always will be, and always has been. And good people have always got to be willing to fight for what's right, or will be consumed by the evil. And today it's the communists. Before that it was the Nazis. Before that was the communists. And now it's the communists and militant Islam, fundamentalist Islam. Get rid of them, there'll be something else. That's not very hopeful, is it?
Go ahead.
Good afternoon, Karen. I understand from accounts that I've read that non-potentized spirulina in tablet form has been given in tens and thousands of dollars worth to General Wali Khan and other freedom fighters in Afghanistan. I'd like to know if it has actually gotten to them, and if in accordance with the accounts it's really proved to be beneficial as a survival food on the long marches that they have to make.
Oh, I'm not sure what non-potentized means, but I do know about the spirulina, and I must say that with all the fad foods on the market and everything, we checked it out very carefully before we sent it to the freedom fighters. And yes, it has arrived, it has been dispensed inside Afghanistan, but it takes so long to get any reports back out. And the condition of the people is so god-awful desperate, the malnutrition and the diseases and everything else, that we don't know yet what effect it's had, but it cannot help but to have helped, because these people desperately need high potency vitamins, protein, minerals, and so forth, supplements. This little boy in Salt Lake, when we picked him up, when he arrived in New York, his hands were pointed like this, like cups. By the time he arrived in Salt Lake, they had completely curled in on themselves in a way that you and I can't do. And it was because all of the calcium and potassium in his body had finally been totally depleted, because all the way from Pakistan he suffered from uncontrollable diarrhea and vomiting. And what little nutrients he had left in his body were gone by the time he arrived in Salt Lake. So to get these kind of things like spirulina and other protein and mineral and vitamin supplements to those people is going to save lives. And we got to get it there in bigger quantities, because there was a very large shipment that went, but we're talking about 7 to 10 million people who need it, and need it daily and all the time in areas where there's nothing to eat but tree bark and roots and dirt.
I'd be very interested in getting a copy of the video from today so that I can show it at a leadership conference of Light Force spirulina distributors to encourage private donations from the distributors and also from the Light Force company itself to further the donations to Afghanistan.
Well, we'd like to see people donate things like that too, and be grateful for any contribution of anything that will help save those people's lives.
God bless you in your work.
Thank you. God bless you.
Thank you.
Karen, my question concerns the home front. 1 year ago, I wrote to President Reagan about Afghanistan, and what concerns me is I didn't even receive a reply from the White House.
I don't either when I write to the President.
Okay. I received the reply from the State Department.
Oh, yes.
And I wanted to know, since
from
that
Phyllis Oakley.
Pardon me?
From Phyllis Oakley.
Oh.
Was that who signed it?
Yes. I wanted to know if that is one of our prime solutions. What do you suggest we do?
Keep them coming, because it's going to have an impression sooner or later. Somebody in the White House did read that, and somebody made a little notation that White House mail is flowing on the Afghanistan issue in favor of supporting the Afghans. Phyllis Oakley ends up answering everything that somebody writes to the President. But if the President's flooded with Afghanistan mail, Phyllis is going to run out of hands to respond to all of it. And Phyllis Oakley is the Afghanistan desk officer, part of the establishment problem. A beautiful, attractive, warm-hearted, eloquent, nice lady who talks out of both sides of her face, is an accomplished and fluent liar, and can tell you with all the conviction in the world that it was her idea in the first place to get American doctors in, that she's been fighting for years for effective aid for the Afghans, and then turn right around and kick the chair out from under you. And do it with such a warm and concerned smile. Oh, you fell. Yeah, the State Department ends up with all of the mail in Afghanistan. But let's just keep it pouring in there, because eventually somebody's going to say to Mr. Reagan, hey, Mr. President, we're getting an awful lot of mail on the Afghanistan issue saying the same thing. And start pinging the State Department as the problem, and maybe that will help him wake up. We sent a letter to him a couple weeks ago, signed by all the leaders of all the conservative organizations in Washington, saying, Mr. President, we know how you feel about Afghanistan, but do you know that the State Department is actively subverting your will on this? And we won't get a response to that, I'm sure. Or if we do, it'll come from Phyllis Oakley, saying, oh, but you're wrong on this. We just haven't been able to find the means to do it yet. But keep those letters going.
Okay, thank you.
Snow them.
Karen, I received the Washington Times in the mail, and I find that it's probably as good a informative piece of information as I can get, and I'm wondering how we can use that as a tool. Because, like for instance, a couple of weeks ago I read about the I think it was 20 MiG jets that were blown up right on the ground by the Mujahideen, and then a couple days later about the Afghan pilots that were executed that were on the Soviet side as a result of it, because the Soviets didn't know who the Mujahideen were, and they knew it was an inside job. And it occurs to me that that we need to put some sort of pressure with the use of this tool, the Washington Times, which seems not to be afraid to publish these things, upon the rest of the media. And I'm wondering, and upon also the Congress and the Senate, and what can we do? What's the best way to do that? Xerox copies, send them to people, demand, maybe from the other major medias, why it's not being covered.
The Times is an excellent vehicle for this. And the only problem is that the Times detractors are still dismissing it as a Mooney paper. And the Mooney religion is a great conspiracy and all of that. So there are limitations to the influence the Times will have. Eventually, I think it will gain the same respectability and acceptance as the Christian Science Monitor because it's no more fringy and has less church influence in it. And the Christian Science Monitor is certainly a highly respected journal, accepted as a secular newspaper, and the Washington Times look at there too. So right now, though there are those slight limitations on using the Times as a source, but by all means use it because nobody else is doing it. I'm glad you're getting your Times in the mail. You know, they have a lot of trouble with their circulation, and I don't get it in my office sometimes right there in Washington. we miss a lot of issues. I'll have to talk to him about how you get it in California, and I can't get it in Washington. But it is excellent, and they have, and under Arnaud de Bourgrave, they've become more aggressive, and I like it. You know, that guy doesn't fool around, and nobody's going to push him around. And nobody can accuse him of being a Mooney stooge or anything like that. You know, poor Jim Whalen was kind of an unknown coming from the Sacramento Bee. And, but Arnaud de Bourgrave established his credentials long ago as a respected journalist. He was a senior Newsweek editor for 17 years and then was fired for writing The Spike, which suggested that the media might manipulate the news or that the Kremlin might manipulate the media. But he is a respected anti-communist, which means that he's suspect to the liberal community. The Newsweek didn't even have the grace to review his book, which has become a bestseller, or his second book either. But yeah, Xerox copies of anything that you can get that covers the Afghanistan issue favorably. Take our literature, please, and give it to anybody you can. Because the only way we're going to get this story across to the American people is on a person-to-person basis, because the big media, the big-time guys, the mainstreamers, aren't going to do the job for us. You know, that Chaudhry is going to continue to cover up everything.
Also, you know, there was a second point I wanted to ask you about, and that's this decomposed uranium bullet that is able to penetrate tanks and go right within a normal rifle. What do you know about that?
You can make an armor-piercing round for any kind of a weapon. As you say, it's spent nuclear fuel, but the controls on it are rigid. You know, just as they're trying to get control of the Teflon-coated bullet, because it will pierce police body armor as easily as it will pierce a criminal's car or heart or anything else. And unfortunately, the Teflon bullet got out into the civilian community's hands and is being used against police. So all these expensive Kevlar body armor will be worthless if they're Teflon bullets in criminals' guns. The same with the armor-piercing round. Because nuclear fuel and even spent fuel can be so readily controlled and is so readily controlled, you and I can't go home to our garage workshop and make an armor-piercing bullet. It can really basically only be done by governments. And they're going to control the numbers that get into private hands too, because you could shoot down an airliner from the ground with an armor-piercing bullet from a high-powered rifle. So they're going to control these things at all costs. Now, I have been arguing in the State Department. We don't talk too much about weapons and means and all of this for obvious reasons. But I have been arguing for the supply of these kind of weapons, these kind of munitions to the Afghans for obvious reasons. But so far without any success. But armor-piercing rounds are easy to make, readily made from readily available spent fuel. You can't do a whole lot of things with spent nuclear fuel. And I hope that one day that we will see these things supplied to the Afghans with any kind of controls that any kind of government wants to put on them. As for, you know, one of the arguments against giving these people effective anti-aircraft weapons, a Stinger, say, or the Red Eye, has been the fear that it might fall into enemy hands. You know, the PLO would love to have a Red Eye to shoot down a civilian airliner. Well, they've got all the SAM-7s and SAM-7Bs they need to do the job. And the only way a Red Eye or a Stinger or an armor-piercing round could fall into enemy hands is right up his tailpipe where it belongs. You know, it's a good way to deliver ammunition supplies to the enemy, is through the business end of a rifle or a weapon you're holding. But they're feasible, they can be made, they should be made, they aren't being made for the Afghans, and I hope that they will be.
So we should encourage them to be made and shipped, should we?
Sure, sure, absolutely. Encourage anything that you can. You know, eventually I hope it will work before it's too late.
Terry, we'd like to ask you to sing your Afghan song that you sang in Washington. Come on up here and do it. While you're getting ready, Karen, will you tell us about your literature so we can send for it?
Oh, yes. So we put out a spasmodic Free Afghanistan report. I say spasmodic because in past years we've lacked the resources to put them out regularly, but Henry Kriegel's working with us now, and this will be part of his job, to put out a regular update on Afghanistan and what's happening in the world vis-a-vis Afghanistan. This postcard, I think, is a gem. This was worked up by the people in my office. We had a wonderful rally on the steps of the Capitol a little while back. 200 high school kids from 20 area public and private high schools in the Washington area rallied on the steps of the Capitol with hundreds of helium-filled green balloons bearing messages to Gorbachev, and with this postcard taped to it. And we released those balloons in the hopes that they'd land somewhere and somebody stick a stamp on it and send it to Gorbachev. It's a picture of Afghan children behind barbed wire that symbolizes the imprisonment and the deportation of Afghan children. It says, "Mr. Gorbachev, you have forcibly taken tens of thousands of Afghan children to the Soviet Union for 10 years of communist indoctrination. Freedom lovers from around the world demand that you return the Afghan children now. Please pick up one of these postcards, stick a stamp on it, what is it, 13 cents or 15 cents per postcard, mail it off to the Soviet embassy." I doubt that Gorbachev will get it, but they read their mail too. And if nothing else, it will harass them and make them mad. And anytime you can kick the Russian bear in the shins, you've done something good. We've got quite a lot of literature. I see that you've all picked up the brochure and some of the posters. We put out dynamite posters. They're collector's items. We've got buttons and bumper stickers and other supplies, and we can provide you with all of the information you need. If any of you are writing school papers or doing studies on Afghanistan, we have the best collection of Afghanistan resource data in the country, as well as film footage and photos and news clippings and so forth. And we'll be glad to provide you with anything that we can and help you in any way we can. At the same time, we've had from your church, I have found out a lot of good people have contributed their ideas, their talents, and their abilities to us. Like Terry, like Orrin and Carolyn, where are they? They're here somewhere. Kathleen and other friends have done wonderful volunteer work for us, the Concerned Citizens groups, and I see several of them here from Washington. You guys just pop up everywhere. I always thought in Washington that you were real angels to be helping me so much, and I'm beginning to suspect, especially since Carolyn sings like an angel, and here you are here, everywhere I go.
Well, here we go, Terry.
The story behind this hat that I have been given is that Karen McKay brought this back from Pakistan. I understand that's true. You went over to pick up some of these people who were terribly injured and needed to come back to the United States, and this was amongst some of the things that she brought. And I wear it proudly. When I sing for these fundraising dinners, I wear it as the mantle of the child, and the children and the mujahideen, and of course the freedom fighters, the elderly, the women, and all of those who are being persecuted. We disarm the Afghans and kill off their crops and get them to surrender their home. We call them the rebels and look away from their cause and let them fight for their life all alone. And let them fight for their life all alone. Oh, what did I do, Mommy? What have I done? Why are they bombing our land? And why did that toy that fell from the sky blow up and take one of my hands? In the world there is starving, in the world there is strife, and grown men fight grown men in war. But to blow off the hand of a young, gentle child is a crime we've not heard of before. We disarm the Afghans and kill off their crops and get them to surrender their home. We call them
rebels look away from their cause and let them fight for their life all alone. And let them fight for their life all alone. How many have seen a young boy set a fire in front of his mom and his dad for the crime of not telling where the noble ones hide? Have the soldiers in the whole world gone mad? What would you do if these children were yours? Could you put all these things from your mind? Let we now, the people, take a stand in defense of the noble ones holding the line. Help now the Afghan, help now their cause. Take a stand in defense of their home. Put your lives, sacred honors, and fortunes on line. Let him know he's not in this alone. Let him know he's not in this alone. Help now the Afghan, help now his cause. Take a stand in defense of his home. Put your lives, sacred honors, and fortunes on line. Let him know he's not in this alone. Let him know he's not in this alone. Sing along with me. Help now the Afghan, help now his cause. Take a stand in defense of his home. Put your lives, sacred honors, fortunes on line. Let him know he's not in this alone. Let him know he's not in this alone. Help now the Afghan, help now his cause. Take a stand in defense of his home. Put your lives, sacred honors, fortunes on line. Let him know he's not in this alone. Let him know he's not in this alone. Allahu Akbar.
Allahu Akbar.
Thank you very much, Terry. Hope it becomes a hit.
The hat that he's wearing, the pakur, that I brought back a few from Pakistan, it's the Afghan national hat from the northern half of Afghanistan, which is now being adopted by freedom fighters all over because of the convenience and comfort of it. When you're in combat and you've got to wrap 38 yards of turban, sometimes it can get to be a problem. And so this has become the symbol of the Afghan resistance. And it's the white color that is worn by Brigadier Safi, who is one of my favorite people in the entire world. And I think that he would be honored if you had a white pakur.
Oh, thank you.
To symbolize the work that you do.
Karen, I am the one who is truly honored to be able to wear something of such an honorable and brave man. Thank you.
You're an honorable, brave lady, that's obvious, and I think you would feel good to know it, and I'll tell him when I get to Peshawar. This is Brigadier Safi. Brigadier Safi is a lifetime soldier in Afghanistan, has given his life for his country. He was trained by the British SAS, by the Soviet Spetsnaz, their special forces, and the U.S. Special Forces. One heck of a guy. He was the commander of Afghan Special Forces, has spent a couple of years in Kabul's prisons for serving his country too well, 15 months of it in isolation, solitary confinement. I wouldn't want to be in a Kabul jail. It's not like being in an American prison. And retired to England, and when his country was actually invaded, he came back to fight for his country. And he's given up a very comfortable life in retirement as an English country gentleman to go back and fight for his country. And he's there now remolding and shaping the guerrillas into a real fighting force. And I just, he's one of the most beautiful guys in the world. And
he really is, unquestionably. I will be very grateful to join this photo with my photos of many people such as him
If you like,
for
I'll
whom I
take it to
pray.
the shower and get it autographed if he's not inside.
Oh, terrific. Let me
We
make a
tried-
copy so I can keep a focus of him to pray for, and then you can get this one autographed.
If you like, I'll take it over and have him autograph it. We tried to bring him to the States last September for a speaking tour and to go to Fort Bragg and to the Soldier of Fortune Convention and things like that. And came the day for him to arrive, and we got a message from Peshawar that he had a little problem with 30,000 Soviets in a 360-degree angle around him in Paktia province, and wouldn't be able to make it just now. So in February, I went after him myself, because by golly, no Soviet T-62 tank is going to get in my way when I go after my man. We brought him back, and we had him in the States. He was out here in Los Angeles and San Diego and San Francisco and on a tour all over the country. He's just, you know, he talks like an Englishman, and is just, you know, one of those people who ought to be an inspiration to absolutely everybody, because he's had it all. He had the opportunity to get out of it all and to stay out of it all, and he's gone back. And there he'll die, yeah, because he's not going to give up. And it's just, you know, his 85-year-old father was a freedom fighter commander in the Koisafi Mountains and was executed by the Soviets last year as an 85-year-old freedom fighter commander. His sister was killed last year in the bombings in the Koisafi Mountains. He's lost his whole family. His wife is still alive with him in Peshawar. And, you know, he, to me, epitomizes what every human being ought to be, what every patriot ought to be.
They know there's an eternal flame, don't they? And they move on with the flame, and they're willing to sacrifice their bodies, but never their spirits.
No, that's absolutely right.
And here we sacrifice our spirits and preserve our bodies.
So true.
Thank you, Karen. We'd like
Thank you very much.
We'd like to offer the song of Carolyn Yost to you once again with the children now.
Ah, my angel.
On the battlefield of life, a holy war, a youth takes aim, a marksman sure, to show that faith and hope are alive, that no one on earth can make the soul die.
Battlefield of life, a holy war, the battlefield of life, a holy war.
He stands on the hill facing the sun and begins each morning anew, not trusting the lies of the world outside, but believing the truth of his youth. My child, bend the knee only in prayer, in service to life and to God. Roar like the lion to scare the beast and guard the pathway of life.
A holy war, the battlefield of life, a holy war.
The battle is raging, he knows time will come when the beast will fall by the way. He's not standing alone, but biding his time till heaven and earth come to aid. As he lays down to sleep in a strange cold land, away from his family and home, he dreams of the valleys and high mountain peaks where in stillness and peace he once roamed. My child, bend the knee only in prayer, in service to life and to God. Roar like the lion to scare the beast and guard the pathway of life.
A holy war, the battlefield of life, a holy war.
Take heed, guard the heart, do not despair, for the battle you fight fight is for all. Be fearless, be brave, be a ray of light for the child, and you will never fall. Stand tall, be proud, sing and shout, for victory's flame burns bright. Keep it blazing while God is raising more sons and daughters for the fight. My child, bend the knee only in prayer, in service to life and to God. Roar like the lion to scare the beast and guard the pathway of life. So bend the knee only in prayer, in service to life and to God. Roar like the lion to scare the beast and guard the pathway of life. God is great, God is great, God is great. Allahu Akbar.
Thank you so much. That was really a thrill to hear. A great joy.
I'd just like to say one thing. I don't know what you prefaced before we came in, but to date, the children of Asia and a lot of the Eastern Bloc communist countries have heard this now over Voice of America and also translated in their respective languages. 700 Club picked up this song and has aired it in the middle of a special they did on defending democracy. So it has gotten some air, and hopefully we'll be able to do more to get the message out that these children need help.
Are they giving your version, or when they translate it, do they have someone else singing it?
No, they're giving actually the soundtrack underneath the translation done in recitative, and then they're singing the song in English, or playing the song in English by us.
So it's a song to the children, and the
It is
children
a
are
song to
hearing
the
it.
children.
Isn't that marvelous?
William Manchester wrote a wonderful book called Goodbye Darkness, in which he remembered his life in World War II as a Marine sergeant on the sands of the South Pacific beaches. And he asked himself toward the end of that book, and he wrote this in the end of the 70s, whether America's young people today would be willing to unquestioningly throw themselves in the lethal teeth of enemy machine gun fire on a beach on an island they couldn't pronounce and didn't know where it was, because somebody told them it was forgotten country. And he concluded at the end of that book that he didn't think they would anymore. Well, thanks to Reagan, we've had a revolution in this country of sorts, and maybe today's young people will be willing to sacrifice and pay the price. But by God, the State Department and the media sure aren't going to do it, and they're not going to give anybody else the opportunity to even know there's a need to do it. These people do not believe in sacrificing anything, certainly not their careers or the possibility they might get a bad efficiency report from their superior by advocating some kind of action in defense of American interests. We're dealing with a bunch of ideological wimps over there. And I don't know of any way to get them out except to, if we can get Congress to change the laws by which the State Department runs itself. But Foreign Service is a self-perpetuating institution. They are the only ones who have the right of hire and fire and rules and regulations within their institution. And they were given that mandate by Congress. The same with the Civil Service. And so long as they have the power to hire only those like themselves and to bring them up in their own image, we're not going to see any change. You know, as I said, these are the same people who slammed the door on the Jews in the Holocaust. And they're still there today, and they will be there 100 years from now. Unless somebody gets mad enough and say, I'm mad as hell and I ain't going to take no more, and does something about it. And that's going to have to be Congress in this case. Because Congress holds the purse strings. And only Congress ultimately has any authority over people like the Immigration Service, the Foreign Service, Civil Service, and so forth. Congress has been able to prevent the President from having the appointed officials he wants, and Congress could wield that kind of power over the State Department if it would. But we've got to make them see the correlation. Because right now, Congress is getting mad as hell and isn't going to take any more on the Afghanistan issue. Gordon Humphrey, God bless him, is the head of this joint task force that has done some wonderful things with us. And, you know, Senator Gary Hart is one of our people on Afghanistan, believe it or not. He was the one who wrote the letter, co-signed by a dozen members of Congress from both sides of the political spectrum, that got our 7 wounded freedom fighters into Walter Reed last summer, over the State Department's dead body. We won that one, and they swore we're not going to win another one. So with this kind of support, and the support of the American people, if people will just write letters and have demonstrations and show, you know, you can't wait for the elections to come around every 2 or 4 years. You know, that's supposed to be the ultimate form of the people expressing their will, but it's not that simple. That's too pat. You got to have demonstrations, you got to write letters, you got to have events, you got to do media events and so forth.
America, you've heard the story. We've got the machinery. We can do it. Let's make it happen. Karen McKay, Executive Director for the Committee for a Free Afghanistan, thank you for being the flame of freedom that speaks at Summit University Forum.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity and the honor of being here. It's been a real privilege and a real eye-opener for me.
We do thank you for coming. It's a real treat to know you.
Thank you.
You have been watching Summit University Forum with Elizabeth Clare Prophet. Summit University Forum, where the flame of freedom speaks. Elizabeth Clare Prophet, noted author, lecturer, and educator, interviews the special people who provide the missing dimension to the news that affects you. Courageous men and women from all over the world who have taken a stand for truth and justice and become spokesmen for the flame of freedom.